Thank you for tuning in to the Island Treasures podcast. We value the insights shared by our guests and host, but it's important to note that their personal experiences are intended to inform and encourage, and not to replace professional, legal, or medical advice. With that, we are ready for today's exciting episode. Welcome to Island Treasures, a place for caregivers to hear encouragement from other caregivers, who by sharing their experiences offer helpful information and resources for your caregiving journey. I am your host and caregiver consultant, Alison Van Schie from beautiful Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. And before we dive into today's episode, I want to let you know that Island Treasures is set up to receive fan mail. So you can text the podcast directly through the link at the bottom of the show notes. Today we are joined by my former podcast guest, Betsy Haddad. Betsy is here to provide an update on what she's been busy doing since her first appearance on the podcast in 2021, in the episode called The Musician's Daughter. Since that episode, her father Edward passed away, and Betsy has dedicated herself to activism, driven by her desire to prevent others from suffering the way that her dad did with Alzheimer's disease. She has many takeaways from her experience to share with us today, so please join me now as I welcome Betsy back to the podcast. So welcome back to the podcast, Betsy Haddad. It is wonderful to see you again and to have you here to share some nuggets of wisdom with our listeners.
Thank you.
So what's been happening?
Oh gosh, a lot. I'm still working full time. I work for Florida Blue. That's Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Florida. So I'm very busy with that. I have 2 young adult sons, and they are in such exciting formative stages of their lives right now. My older son is in his last year at UCS, where they have an excellent computer science program and engineering program. So he's going to graduate with a degree in that in May. He's already got a job lined up, so I'm happy about that. But I'm getting very much closer to having an empty nest. And actually, it's my younger son that jump-started that, because my younger son went right into the Navy out of high school. That was a decision I didn't see coming. We don't have military experience in the immediate family, but he decided, based on the strength of his experience in the the ROTC in high school, that happened during the pandemic, and he really sort of caught into the structure there. It was really great for him. It was the Naval ROTC, and he excelled in that, took a leadership role there, and then he tested and went into the nuclear program of the Navy, and he volunteered for submarine service. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, submarine service. It's not for everybody, but
No.
to me, it's so significant because I don't think I mentioned this in an earlier interview, but my father, who died of Alzheimer's in 2022, worked for Electric Boat for 33 years. That is one of the facilities in the United States where they make our nuclear submarines. Yeah,
Wow, full circle.
isn't that amazing? Dad literally worked in engineering and quality control for his entire career at Electric Boat. I never, at the time when I was growing up, paid any attention to that or had any inkling that one of my sons would actually grow up to walk onto these machines and go in them into the ocean. And, while on one hand, I'm sad that my father didn't live to see this happen. On the other hand, I like to believe that Dad is watching over Christian's progress.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe he pulled some strings somewhere behind the scenes, but I know how proud he would be. But really, I'm just so happy. That was a great victory to come out of the tragedy in that year that my father died. That actually, ironically, was the year that Christian left for boot camp. So he left in that same summer of the year when my father died. And I was very bitter about that at first. I had a lot of bitterness. I think people go through maybe a stage of bitterness in their grief after they've been through a really difficult caregiving experience. And I was very bitter about the circumstances of my father's death, all his suffering. And then on top of that, losing my younger son to boot camp. He left right after high school. He left home. That was the abrupt end of childhood.
Yeah.
He went off, and he was actually there over the holidays. So he was away from us during Thanksgiving, Christmas,
Just when
my
you
birthday.
needed him there.
Oh, I mean, I guess that was kind of a selfish need, but I really felt the loss of my father at that holiday season, and also my younger son. It's just, it's hard to see fewer full seats around the holiday table. That's really something that people notice a lot. I think maybe in their first year, maybe it hits more in the second year, whenever it hits. But it's hard, that empty seat at the table. And I had two that year, my father and Christian, and I was bitter. I was so bitter about it. I remember I would walk my dogs every day as I do, and sometimes when I'd walk around the block, I'd sort of like rail against God, and I'd say, "Why did you do this? Why did the timing have to turn out like this?" But funny thing happened later. Because Christian was so delayed in going to boot camp, he could have gone in the summer, but there were some paperwork delays, and it ended up that he left ironically on my birthday in October. Because of the timing, it ended up that he was assigned to this particular submarine in Connecticut. And who knows if it would have turned out like that if he hadn't gone at the time that he did. So I came to see later that it was really for the best, that he went when he did. I didn't see it at the time.
When you mentioned that he left on your birthday, there's no wonder you were bitter. Like it's like, no,
Absolutely.
Mama needs her boys.
It was so difficult, and there was an added layer of bitterness too. My mother had obviously so much even more grief than I did to work through, and she and I went through a really difficult period around sort of getting rid of my father's effects and her moving into a smaller place and downsizing. It was really for the best for her, but it really strained us. We were strained throughout the journey of my father's care because we didn't always see eye to eye on what should be done. And she, as the main caregiver, as the spouse, of course, it was 100% her decision. My role could only be to support what she wanted to do, what was best for her. But it was difficult. It was difficult for me to step back because I live here, and also I'm very, very close to my father. Always have been. So that was a really, really difficult thing. And after his death, not only did she have to plan all the funeral arrangements and plan basically two ceremonies, one here and one in Connecticut, where we're from, but getting rid of his things, I think everybody goes about that in their own way. And the way that she decided to do it was to have an estate sale. And for folks that have really valuable items or luxury home, I think it can be a very good way to go. In our case, it's kind of funny how it turned out. My father had a great many unique possessions and wonderful items, which I personally loved. But how can I say this charitably? They weren't worth a lot monetarily.
Well, I remember you talking about in The Musician's Daughter, your first
Yes.
appearance on the podcast, which is 4 years ago, Betsy. I remember you saying that your dad loved to go thrift shopping, and that was one of his activities that he was able to participate in with his companion. But it's no wonder that there was a few eclectic items in your home that your mom chose to get rid of through an estate sale.
Yeah, and I really understand that, from her perspective, that it was easier to do it that way. But it put me in the awkward position after the estate sale company was hired. They have very strict rules, and I was put in an awkward position of having to actually go and buy back a few items that I remembered giving to him. This is such a
Oh.
bizarre experience. Isn't that so funny? And I know that it wasn't intended to turn out that way, but that's how it went. And it also was very difficult for me to go into their house, which she was moving out of, and see all of my father's prized possessions laid out against the wall for strangers to paw through. It was very hard. It was very bitter, very difficult. And then there were things of a more practical nature. He was a very handy person. In addition to being a brilliant engineer and a fantastically talented musician, he was really good around the house and great with yard work. So he had a lot of yard tools that in retrospect would have been really useful for me to have at my house. Now, this is on me that I didn't make more of a push for those things when perhaps I could have. I think I certainly didn't help my mother because in my own grief, it was very hard for me to go back to the house after he died because he died there. I know that was his wish. And in fact, it was kind of a funny or maybe bittersweet thing. But the morning that he died, I was very fortunate to be there. Something told me that the night that I stayed overnight, which I rarely did because I only lived about 10 minutes away. So I usually would go home to my house after helping care for him. But I stayed there that last night. I slept on the couch. And in the morning, my father died. So it's just my mother and myself that were there. But I will always be grateful that I was there, that I was able to be there. And when they came to take his body away, I remembered something that he had said, that he had joked about with us earlier in his journey. And he said, "I'm leaving this house feet first." By which he meant that, he didn't want to be forced out of his house. But I remember that he said that. And when they came to take the body, I said, "Remember, he wanted to go out feet first."
Aw,
And so they turned the bag around and they took him out feet
aw,
first. That was
aw,
a hard thing, but I know that my mom was glad I remember that. It
aw.
oddly it brought us some comfort in the moment. It's funny the things that you remember. But after that, I really didn't want to spend a lot of time in the house. And I'm sorry now for that, for my mother's sake, because I think that was hard for her. Although she planned to downsize, she didn't want to leave right away. And there was a pool in the house that she loved, and she wanted to spend perhaps the last season there and didn't want to rush her decision, although she had, pretty good idea where she was going to go. And so she still had some time in the house. And I think I could have been more helpful. I wish I had been more helpful. But that would have been the time for me to perhaps go through the items in a more organized way. But I didn't do that. Maybe I was in denial. Maybe I just thought, I have time. I don't need to do this now. It's too painful. So I didn't do it. And then she signed on with the estate sale company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Retrospect, looking
Yeah,
back,
retrospect,
yeah.
everybody has regrets about certain things. And, in retrospect, that's not such a big deal. I was fortunate to get some things. He had a big collection of sort of model cars that I got several of for my sons, and that was nice. And my older son, who was going to college and, was still here with me, he was able to go over with me on a couple of occasions, and he has a really good eye for unique art items, and he was able to find a few things. And I think, being just far enough removed from it, for me, it was very painful to look at some of my father's things with sort of a dispassionate eye. But Garrison, my older son, was really good at it. And he was able to salvage a few items that I probably would have missed if it hadn't been for him. So he was really a great help. He was very practical and organized about it. So the estate sale happened, and the things were sort of done away with. And of course, my mother didn't make a great deal of money on the estate sale. So one caution I guess I would give to people is, with an estate sale, it's certainly worth it if you have a lot of high value items and you really, you think that they're going to show well in the house. We didn't really have that. So she didn't end up making a lot of money on the estate sale, but it caused us a lot of grief. That was the big takeaway from that. So that was tough. And I lost a bunch of yard tools that I could have really used. So I think I was unnecessarily bitter about that. It wasn't my mother's fault. If anything, it was my fault for not speaking up sooner.
Yeah.
But I was bitter. And there was a time after my mother moved into her new place, we had a big emotional scene about this estate sale.
Oh,
I still really take that to heart. Ironically, I think it was probably even more difficult than any of the emotional scenes we'd had when my father was still alive, when we were sort of at odds over his care. Isn't it strange? But maybe it was that we felt we could both finally have release. So I felt somehow compelled that I needed to tell my mother how difficult this had been with the estate sale, and how I wished that she hadn't done this, and how these yard items would have really helped me in my house. Why I felt I needed to say this, I'm not entirely sure, but I said this. And my mother was just heartbroken. She said, "Oh, I know you're never going to forgive me for this." And she just had a complete breakdown, much worse than any of the breakdowns I'd seen when dad was still alive. So I felt terrible. Yes, I unburdened myself, but was that really necessary?
you unburdened yourself, and yet you burdened yourself with the grief
I
that you're now
did.
feeling that you imposed upon her.
I
But
did.
you both were carrying so much
We
through the
were.
passing of your
We
dad
really were. We
and through the
were.
caregiving of your dad.
Absolutely. In some ways, of course, I wish I'd been the bigger person when I could have. But in other ways, after we got through that heartache, and we're a couple years out now. My mother's living in a smaller place that she really likes, and it has a lot of activities for her. It's really been a great change for her. But I think now, because I was one layer removed from the immediate caregiving, my mother was, I think, really exhausted, at the end of a rope by the caregiving, as most people who have to be the close-up person are. But I, by virtue of being one layer removed, had, I think, more energy, and also by virtue of the age difference, and so I very much have been motivated to use that to be the activist. I think that's on me. I was there to see everything, but I also have the advantage of a little bit more, that one layer being removed. And I have the energy, I have the time, I have the motivation. It's up to me to be the change that I want to see. It's not something that my mother should feel compelled to do. She deserves whatever peace she can find at this time. But people in my generation, I'll generalize and say Generation X, a lot of us are seeing our parents struggling. We certainly know people, if we haven't been directly impacted, we know people who have. I don't know how any responsible person in my generation is not looking ahead to the contingencies of their own aging. I know I've spoken about this before, but one of the best things I did for myself in the year that my father died after his death, that summer, I went and bought myself a hybrid long-term care insurance policy.
Mm.
That word hybrid is really important here. My parents had a long-term care insurance policy, but I was shocked to discover, and so were they, unfortunately, that it had a lot of limitations on what it would cover. People so often don't read their insurance policies. Hey, working in the insurance industry, I can guarantee you that's a fact. And insurance policies are boring to read. But the letter of the law matters, doesn't it? And what happened in their case is that the insurance policy only paid full benefits if my father would be institutionalized. And
Oh,
this is common. Yeah, this is common with traditional long-term care. So we did everything we could to keep him at home, but that meant that my mother had to pay out of pocket for most of the services to help him at home. So of course, folks with that kind of insurance policy are somewhat incentivized to put their person in a facility because that's the only way they can get the full benefit of the policy. It's sort of a use it or lose it situation.
since you're in the insurance business, do you know if that's universal?
Well, it tends to be universal with what they call traditional long-term care insurance. Yes, the hybrid policy, those are relatively new. It's the hybrid policy that allows you to sort of have that care wherever you want to have it. It's portable in a way. If you want to have the care in your home, then you get the same benefit paid that you would if you had care in a facility setting. So that's why I bought it, because my big takeaway from my father's care journey was that if that were me, I would never want to go into a facility setting. And if I say that, it's up to me to make it possible to be cared for at home. It's not up to my sons to figure out how to do that. It's up to me to prepare responsibly. And I certainly can't put that off until such time as I might become incapacitated, mentally or physically. So that means I need to take steps now while I'm in good health and of sound mind to say, these are my wishes and this is how my care can be paid for. So that's why I bought the insurance policy. In good health, I was able to qualify. I'm in my mid 50s, and that's a good time to buy it. It's not great to wait because once you get later than that, you tend to have more health conditions that could prevent you from qualifying for such a policy. So I bought it now, and what it means is that I will have a monthly benefit that my sons can draw on if I'm incapacitated and I want to have care in my home, a benefit that will pay for a caregiver in my home. And if I end up not needing that care, if I don't have dementia, then my sons get a death benefit when I die, like a very generous death benefit that will pay for all my expenses and, some extra for them. So that's why they call it a hybrid. It has, several uses. So it's for me, it's peace of mind. Of course, I hope that I won't develop dementia, but everybody should plan responsibly because there are no guarantees in this life. And to that end, I wanted to tell you about something else that I did this past year that brought me a lot of peace of mind. And it's about the possibility of developing dementia. Now, right now, of course, there are no guarantees. We can't tell. Family history is an indicator. Lifestyle issues are an indicator, but the science is still in development. How much do these factors count? Can we predict who is going to develop Alzheimer's? Well, one of the tools that has come onto the horizon here, although it's not widely used yet, it's showing tremendous promise, and it's a very simple blood test. It's a blood test that ideally, if approved by the FDA and if rolled out for full use, your PCP could give you as part of your normal blood work when you go for a wellness exam at a certain age. Kind of similar to the way that over age 50, they say, hey, it's time to get a colonoscopy. And they screen everybody for that, don't they?
I hope so. I hope they do.
Yes, you would hope so. And
Yeah.
why wouldn't you want to be? Not everybody's
Well,
going
you
to.
don't want to be,
No, you don't want to be.
but you
Although
want
there
to.
too, with the colon screenings, I mean, they have kits now, home kits that are
Yeah.
non-invasive.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
that's
those,
right. It's just
if you don't
started
have
up here.
indicators.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah.
the blood test is meant to be a way that it measures a protein level, which is a
Okay,
strong indicator for Alzheimer's. Meaning
okay.
that if you show that you have that protein level, you're likely to be on the path to developing Alzheimer's. Again, not a guarantee, but it's certainly a strong indicator. The amazing thing about this test is that it can show that years before you start to have visible symptoms. And that's huge. That's huge because it gives you lead time. It gives you time to make plans. I mean, who wouldn't want that? Especially someone who has seen their parents suffering and seen what they went through. I can understand being afraid to find the results out. In fact, some people asked me when I went to get the test. I volunteered for a clinical trial specifically to get that test. And they said, "Aren't you afraid?" I said, and I told this to my sons too, no, I'm not afraid. What I'm afraid of is not finding out.
Yeah.
Not finding out and losing any chance that I would have had to express my wishes and make choices. That's what scares me.
So
No, I'm proud to be part of the science. Absolutely.
you said it's not yet approved, FDA approved, not
No,
yet.
they're working on that. The science is sound, but FDA approval takes a long time, and they have to show benefit to it. And there are considerations around cost and pricing. You could go out and get it at Quest Labs today. So Quest Labs are offering it, I think, for around $400, but they are definitely not advising folks to go out and do that. Ideally, the idea is that your PCP would encourage you to get that test or would oversee it because your PCP would want to know the results.
So your primary care provider is
Yes,
your PCP.
yes, and that would mean that we as a society we want to train PCPs about the ideal age to recommend such a test so that they're not just wasting it on people who have no reason to take it or doing it too early or doing it multiple times. Ideally you would want to nail down what time frame is it going to give us the most benefit, maybe in your 50s perhaps, similar to how they developed an age guideline for colonoscopies.
That's fascinating. Do
It
you know
is.
how many subjects are involved in the clinical trial?
No, but the great thing, one of the many great things that the Alzheimer's Association has done to help folks discover that, if you go to the Alzheimer's Association website today, they have something called Trial Match. It's a fantastic new tool that you can use on their website. It's an interactive tool. You can use Trial Match and plug in your zip code. You can literally go to that and using your zip code, it's like a locator map. It will tell you, hey, here are clinical trials that are happening near you. If you want to explore some of these, here's the contact information. Here's what ones might be appropriate for you. It's fantastic. It's a way to find out about testing that you can do if you want to. I was very proactive about it. I was actively seeking out a test like that, even when my father was still ill. So I didn't even need to use Trial Match. I was all fired up to get this test. And I went and signed up with one of the same testing organizations that my father had participated with when he was in the Eli Lilly trial for one of the only medications that we have for Alzheimer's. So I went ahead and signed up and I was already in their database. And then they called me and said, hey, do you want to come in and get this test? I said, absolutely, sign me up. I want to come in. Now, the idea would have been if I took the blood test, if it showed that protein level, that would mean that I had an indicator for developing Alzheimer's and that I would go into an ongoing clinical trial with one of the drugs that is being vetted for use with early onset Alzheimer's patients. Because the idea, the hope of those drugs is can we catch it early enough that with the use of the drug, we can either prevent it or substantially delay it. So that was the plan. So I went in and got the blood test. This was in June of this past year and then eagerly awaited the results. And after a few weeks, the doctor called me and said, it's negative. So,
Wow.
yeah, so of course, overall, that was a huge relief. That was a huge relief to me. It meant
Yeah.
that I wouldn't go forward with the clinical trial, but it was a huge relief, and I was so glad that I got it. Ironically, as I recall, I found out about that test just as I was leaving to go on a trip to Connecticut. I was going to see some of my friends, like have a mini class reunion, and I thought to myself, either way this test goes, I want to tell my classmates. It was just a small group of girls. I said, I want to tell them that I had this test. I want to tell them how it turned out because a couple of them had lost parents to Alzheimer's. And I said, I want to go and be able to tell my peers, hey, even though I'm still dealing with the pain of losing dad, I have been able to do something to contribute to the science, and this is what it is. And you can do it too. And every step you take is a step toward helping prevent this kind of agony for our children. At this point in my life, there's nothing I can do to change my own outcome.
Mm.
But what I do say to myself, this is my motivation. It's not my father. My father already died. My motivation is my sons. My sons. I look at my beautiful, my 22 and 20-year-old sons, and I say, how would I feel if I spent all of these decades in between, when I might develop Alzheimer's, and the time that my father died, if I didn't do anything,
Yeah.
if I didn't try to contribute to the science, I know that I would regret that. So that's my motivation. It was not even I didn't even have to have a second thought about it. And I know that my father felt that strongly about participating in the science. Now, granted, he already had a diagnosis by
Yeah.
that point.
Yeah. But if he'd have gotten it 10, 15, 20 years earlier.
He could have. Yeah, that's the hope of the blood test. So
Yeah.
I've been telling, anyone that I can that I took it, of course, easy blood test, painless, you just a routine thing, just like getting your lab work at your PCP's office. They made it so easy for me. They actually even paid me.
They
That's another great
paid
thing.
you?
Yes, clinical trials will pay you. Absolutely. Yes, you get paid to participate. You don't have to do this for free. You're going in there and being willing to get a blood test and everything. Absolutely. They will pay. So I think I got they didn't pay me after I only had the one session. I didn't need to keep going, but they would have given me a gift card, every time that I went if I kept
Wow.
going. So
Yours is a win-win then, like totally
absolutely,
win-win.
it was a win-win.
So, Betsy, you had wanted to come back and visit the podcast to
Yes.
share what you're doing now. And this is a huge part of what you're doing now and your activism. Just tell me more. Like, I know you've got so much that you've
Oh,
been involved with.
there's
And I
so
think it's
much.
been part of how you've been coping and dealing with your
Yes.
grief.
It has been. It's really helped me through. As I said, I was very bitter in that first year because my dad's death coincided with losing Krishna to boot camp. And also the circumstances of my father's suffering, to see the agony of that journey. I mean, I often tell people what drove me to activism. It's not that he died. We all die of something. It's that he suffered in a way that I continue to believe could have been mitigated. That's what made me an activist because my father's just one of millions of people that suffer. And so was my mother, his caregiver. And I'm convinced that there are things we can do to make that journey easier and more dignified for the people that are on it. Everybody has their own agony to go through, but my father's suffering was particularly bitter. I think that pain relief could have been given in greater measure, and that's something that was very, very difficult to watch. It was a takeaway for me, so that if I were ever in a position like that, I would want my sons to be able to easily order that. I would have an advance directive to do that actually, so that I wouldn't have to be lingering and suffering like that, basically starving to death or dying of thirst. It's a really hard thing to watch. We do have medicines that can help with that. Absolutely, we do. So that was very hard. And the sort of ping ponging of trying to put my father in a facility at certain points, having that fail disastrously, and ironically having him suffer much much worse in his behavior and the physical outcome, and then coming home again, being rejected from the facility. I felt that was a disastrous experiment that, while I certainly understand that my mother was at the end of her rope, it didn't work out well. That was very hard. And to that point, I want to tell you about something else very exciting that is being developed in the U.S. right now, being developed by CMS,
Oh, what's CMS?
the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a governmental entity here in the United States, and it basically develops all the standards that Medicare has to, sort of live up to. And so CMS, because it deals largely with the elderly population, it's our version of healthcare for all, but only if you're over a certain age. So they mostly deal with the elderly population. So they're very much attuned to what elderly populations are dealing with, and that's where you tend to find the most Alzheimer's patients. So CMS has premiered a new pilot program this year. In July of this past year, they started something called GUIDE. And GUIDE is somewhat of an acronym. It stands for Guiding an Improved Dementia Experience. GUIDE. And why I'm so excited about this program, oh my gosh, I'm convinced it would have made the difference for my father staying at home and for my mother trying to cope with that. Guide is only aimed at people who are caring for a dementia patient in the home. So it doesn't help folks that are in a facility environment. But what Guide does, and it's paid for by Medicare, so it's not at your own expense, it puts a PCP in charge of the patient, would have been my father in this case, and overseeing him on a monthly basis because the PCP gets a monthly payment from Medicare for overseeing my father's care. And it helps my mother, the caregiver, by putting a care navigator in charge of my father's case. So that helps the person in my mother's position by helping them get medications adjusted, get the patient to appointments, or get them seen in the ways that they need to be without the caregiver having to navigate that. And it would pay for a limited amount of respite care for the caregiver. That would have been my mother, meaning that CMS, Medicare, would pay for that person to have some respite on an annual basis. Every year they would be entitled to some respite care, care that's away from the home where they can actually get a break and someone else is caring for the patient. So that's a huge step. I have to say that one of the things we struggled with the most caring for dad at home was coordinating with the doctor, something that should be so simple, but in practice was really, really difficult, especially when my father was acting up. And, my mother, it's like caring for a toddler, but a real full grown toddler. I mean, it was impossible, for my mother. She couldn't just break away, especially during office hours, and go call the doctor and say, Ed's acting like this. What can you do? Should his medication levels be adjusted? It was an impossible situation for my mother. And then what if my father really did have a medical issue and had to be seen by a provider? Getting him to a provider's office became a logistical nightmare. It was just horrible.
So, does the care navigator have several patients or several clients living with dementia?
Yes.
Okay, so
Ideally,
the
yeah.
care navigator's not in your home, but your mom could speed dial the care
Yes.
navigator,
Yes.
and that person then does the
Yes.
advocacy.
Yep.
Okay, very
Yeah,
good.
that's great because people are just especially when they're in the thick of caregiving and they're just desperate. They're desperate, they're exhausted, they're burned out. They don't have the time. They may not be aware of the resources that are available right in their own area. So that care navigator is really a crucial linchpin. So the other thing is that Guide is doing is incentivizing providers to participate, and providers can sign up with Guide to participate. They have to meet certain standards and be vetted in order to be in the program because they're getting paid like a monthly payment to do this. And then Guide has an interactive map so that if you go to the CMS website and you take a look at Guide, you can actually drill down again by your zip code or your region, and you can see, hey, are there participating providers near me? And if you live in a relatively large urban area like we do here near Orlando, yeah, there are several participating providers nearby. So that means that it's definitely worth your while to see, reach out and see if you can get into that program. And again, it's paid for by CMS. You have nothing to lose from trying. It's still new. It's an 8-year pilot. So certainly CMS is tracking this to see, overall, what are the metrics going to be? Can we see at the end of this 8-year pilot that we actually really measurably improve the experience for these people that were able to take advantage of the services? I feel certain the answer to that's going to be yes, but certainly the more participating providers that we have, the better it's going to be. And, as people find out about it and use it, I wish it had been available when dad was still alive, but
What's the website for Guide?
I would start by going to cms.gov, cms.gov.
That's just American though, right? That's probably
Yes,
just in the
yes,
US.
that is true. It's just in the United States. But it's a model that can work anywhere. And as with so many things that CMS tries here in the United States, they don't just take risks for no reason. They have a pretty good reason to think that this model of care will work. And it's developed on strong medical advice from doctors who have been advising CMS, panels of doctors. And it's a model that is likely to, take root in other places if it shows promise. It just, the model itself is not anything unique. It can be done anywhere, but really every caregiver needs this kind of support. They need not just a doctor to oversee the patient's care, but they really need someone to help them navigate the system. And then they need breaks. They need those respite breaks. If they may not have a family member that's willing to step in, and they sometimes you have got to remove yourself from the situation. It's too much for any one person. Even in facilities, those people are not single-handedly doing that all of the time. They take breaks. They have
Yeah.
entire teams to take care of people,
Yeah, they
and
do.
you can't be a team of one. It's just too much.
No. Well, respite is often the number one need that every caregiver has.
Yeah,
Asking for help is so difficult,
it
as we
is.
find and we hear, but going to a website such as cms.gov
Mhm.
and accessing guide is wonderful. So it is caregiver led though. They're requesting that people sign up. So it's not your primary care provider isn't going to contact you and say, "Hey, there's this great program I think you should sign up for." Like not
I
for
wish they
everybody.
would, but
Yeah.
they probably not every PCP is aware of it yet. It's still new, so it's something that I hope will be promoted. And actually, the Alzheimer's Association is doing a version of that themselves, if you can call it that. I think it's called Ripple, RIPPL, and you can find out about their version of it through the Alzheimer's Association site, and that's at alz.org. Again, it's the model that shows promise, not necessarily, who's doing it per se, but
Right.
that sort of like triangle approach where you've got an overseeing doctor and you've got a care navigator that's working with the patient and, in the home. That's what you need to be able to maintain somebody in a home environment. And it's not realistic for everyone. I mean, not everybody has a home that's suitable to that. Not everybody has a person that is a caregiver. But for those who have those things, people who have a home, people who have a caregiver, living with them, an advocate, if you will. I mean, there's promise in that. And I feel like every person that's able to make use of that model successfully, that's one less person that has to go in a facility and put strain on that system. As we all know, we're facing a nationwide and worldwide shortage of caregivers as the population ages. And we just can't expect to keep putting people away in facilities and overloading those workers. It's not realistic. Here in the United States, it'll be very interesting to see how all the talk about immigration plays out in the new administration. I think we're in for a rude awakening here about how immigrants actually really, really help and are willing to do some of these difficult caregiving jobs
You're
that
right.
are going to be more and more needed.
Well, I remember speaking with Dave Iverson, and he talked about just the wonderful caregivers his mom had, and they were all immigrants. And these people are so willing to serve in positions that not everybody wants to. And as a family caregiver, it's really nice to have people that can come into your home and spell you off as well. So,
Absolutely. It
yeah,
could be a win-win. I mean, when you think about it, some of these immigrants also need a place to live. So, like au pairs for gray hairs. That's what I would call it. I would love it. I mean, that's what I tell my older son, the one that I expect to be. I don't expect him to be doing my caregiving. This is another takeaway from my father's care journey. Whether or not I have dementia, of course, I'm going to need help if I'm granted an old age. And I said, Garrison, I don't expect you to do it, but I expect you to be the administrator for me. That's very different. I feel certain that people in my generation, if they're fortunate to have children and have good relationships with them, that we will see our children using electronic tools and managing our care from a distance. We already have a lot of electronic tools that help us do that, door alarms, alarms on the refrigerator, things of that nature. But I see my son as the person who would vet such a caregiver. Find me a nice young lady from another country that wants to come here and needs a place to live. My house is set up that I could have another person here. She can have her own wing of the house, take care of me. It's a win-win. I think that's great. So, and I'm not unique at all in that. I mean, many people, if they have, the right setup at their house, which, people that own their own homes, they have to think ahead to, maybe if they have a one-story layout such as I have and, enough room for that person, I think it would work out great.
yeah. Because it is a reality, like aging in place, it's a reality. And I know our previous conversation focused heavily on advanced care planning. And I'm so glad to hear you've moved along because at that
Yes.
point, 4 years ago, you hadn't moved very far in your own advanced care plan. And you were motivating people to get started, and you were also motivating yourself to get started doing their advanced care plan. So
Yeah,
you do have an advanced directive now.
I do. And
That's
it's
fabulous.
It's fantastic. My son knows where to find it. And honestly, so much peace of mind with this hybrid long-term
Yeah,
care insurance. I'm
yeah,
so happy to have that.
yeah.
Even after I took the blood test and I said, okay, well, I don't have the protein marker and that's great for me, but I hope that I still get the chance to grow old. And if I do, then, I want to do that in the comfort and dignity of my own home. I think folks deserve that. Yeah.
They do. So, not having the protein marker now, is it possible that 20 years down the road you'll have the protein marker then?
So much science still to come about that, but honestly, the indication so far, and I would not want to speak out of school on this, it seems that this protein marker, it's there at this time. It would have certainly been there for my father.
Mm.
I'm in my mid 50s. It would have absolutely been there for my father. And he developed Alzheimer's, and outward symptoms at what I would call, not that there's ever like a textbook case or anything, but at a typical age, like early 70s. So, yeah, it doesn't mean that I'm completely off the hook. And honestly, there are so many forms of dementia, and I've come to believe that, like, everybody, if you're granted a long enough life, certainly like any other organ in your body, your brain is going to have some impacts, and it's going to be normal to be forgetful about some things. This is not a sign that you have Alzheimer's. Certainly, we all become more frail. And yes, our brains are going to suffer some kind of impact. So with that, you know, I feel pretty certain that I may not develop Alzheimer's. There could be other impacts as I age, and I should be ready for those. Just responsibly preparing for those contingencies is more than half the battle. And honestly, if you have insurance, that's one way to do it. And setting up your home and really thinking ahead to, when you're in a job interview, what is one of those questions that they ask you? Where do you see yourself in 5 or 10 years? Well, I ask myself that about aging. Where do you want to be? Do you want to be near family members? Where would you be happy? Do you want to be in your current home? And really think ahead to that and think about, where are your resources located? Do you have a close relationship with a family member or a friend that you want to be near? It just makes sense to think ahead to that. It doesn't mean that you're thinking about, oh, I'm going to develop Alzheimer's. It means that you're being realistic. And it means that you're giving the greatest gift that you can to your kids. I mean, do you want them to suffer with guessing what you might have wanted? Do you want them to fight with each other? Hopefully not.
Yeah.
So the best way to avoid that is make your own wishes clear and just think ahead.
Yeah. Those are great pieces of advice that you've learned. And such a change in 4 years. Like, really, you were not even thinking of advanced care planning at that point 4 years ago.
No, I was just thinking about my beloved father and
Yeah.
his agony, and that grief will never fully leave me. I don't know if you watch Netflix. I'm sure some viewers do, and this series got a lot of press recently, and I finally brought myself to watch it. I was afraid I would be too upset to really view it. It's a comedy actually, and it stars Ted Danson, and it's called A Man on the Inside. It's a lovely little series, about 8 episodes, I think they've made so far. It's presented as a comedy, but it's got some really poignant moments. And basically, it features Ted Danson, who is the age that he is. So he's an older man now. And in the series, he's a man who's lost his wife to Alzheimer's. And about a year after that, he's sort of going through the motions and, maybe not living his best life, but he answers an ad for someone who's looking for an undercover mole, as it were, to go into this retirement community and solve a crime. And somebody's stealing jewelry and they need somebody to act as a resident and figure out who it is. So there's a lot of comic moments that go with that. But there are also some really tenderly filmed serious moments, and for me, they were very heartrending. They can't get into the drama of every minute detail of somebody's case of Alzheimer's. In the series, his wife has already died, so they maybe shorten some things, but they talk about how at the end of his wife's life, he was apparently ready to put her in a facility. He was exhausted by the caregiving. And even though she had expressed apparently her wishes to him that she never wanted to go to such a place, he broke the promise and he's ready to put her in a memory care unit. And as the show goes on, you find out that right before she was supposed to go in, she died. So he didn't have to put her in the place. But the mental anguish of having to do it, and apparently he didn't tell his adult daughter that he was going to do that. So that was another, he was sort of like really burdened by this guilt. And in the show, the retirement community that he goes to, it's mostly a lot of like, hip, active people, a lot of fun and all this. But there's a wing of the place called the neighborhood, and it's behind a big locked door. And we all know, every one of us that has visited the euphemistically titled memory care unit
Yeah.
knows what that place is, and he knows what it is. And it's very hard for him to go through that door, even though he didn't put his wife in there because she died. It means jail. It means you're never going to get out. It means that once you go through those doors, that's where your life is going to end. And that was very hard to see. You could see him wrestling with that in the show just as an actor. And I tell you, that's when I cried most watching that. Watching when he had to go through those doors, because there's a character in the series who develops dementia. She's living in the retirement community. And this is another thing that is very tenderly done, but all of those of us who have had a family member who developed Alzheimer's can relate. When this person starts to exhibit her symptoms, all of the other residents ostracize her. They stop talking to her. She is marginalized, and it's almost as if they feel it's contagious. It's horrifying to watch, because that's exactly what happened to my beautiful, vibrant, charismatic, loving father. All of his friends abandoned him at the end. There's hardly anyone that would still come see him. And Ted Danson's character in this show does such a beautiful, tender job of reaching out to that woman, and he's the only one that will visit her. He goes through the locked door, and there's some beautiful scenes where he talks to her in the reality that she's in at that time. Talk about music, actually, and he takes her to a show, and it's just so beautifully done. I have to say, I highly recommend that series now.
Oh, I'm
I
glad.
would like it. I thought, oh, this just whitewashes too many things. It makes it look too easy. It does. It's just television. But it also, I think, as well as any show can, it shows the guilt that you can feel after you've been the caregiver, even if you've done, the best job that anyone could do. And it shows his adult daughter forgiving him and all of this kind of thing. And really, it's very well done. So
I look forward to seeing it. I don't have Netflix at this point in time, but I have had it in the past, and you never know, I'll have it again. But you described it so well, and I could hear the emotion in your voice. And yeah, I do hope that folks tune in if they've got Netflix, because it sounds very powerful.
yeah, definitely had to revisit some things for myself there after seeing that. But you do the best that you can in the moment, and my mother did the best that she could too. And all of my takeaways, I feel like they will serve well going forward. I want to pay forward what I can, and I want to try to improve the future for folks to the degree that I'm able. Any way that I can advance the science, any way that I can speak out about the care experience in a way that's relatable or that's helpful to people, anytime I can connect someone with a resource, that's wonderful. That's huge to me. So,
And that's your activism now.
yes, it is.
You have a message. You're a rallier.
Yes. Yeah.
I think I remember seeing you posted something about going on a Washington walk.
I did. Yes, we went. It was when the Alzheimer's Association was trying to get CMS to improve coverage of the drug, one of the only few drugs that we have to treat early onset Alzheimer's. So, yes, we went to Washington and talked to legislators about that, and it was a great experience to go. I loved being able to meet with some legislators, and they were certainly very welcoming. Again, everyone on both sides of the aisle can relate. Everyone knows somebody who's been impacted. I still have mixed feelings about, and I this is one reason why I say, if you're going to be an advocate, you should be willing to participate in the science. But the drug in its current form, it's not a cure. It has shown uneven results, which is not a reason not to take it. Certainly take it if you can, if you're eligible, if your doctor will prescribe it. And it's hugely expensive. And this is something that, if you are going to take a really expensive drug and you are going to want it paid for, that's going to come out of some other place. That's one of the horrible, unfortunate realities of the limitations of the payment system that we have in insurance. It's like that with anything. Home insurance, people are having to face that. There are deductibles, there are co-payments. And unless we can have meaningful price control here in this country about what drug makers can charge, I don't know that I feel right in my conscience about asking someone to pay that much, or asking for it to be paid for and then having it impact other Medicare members for something that might buy me an improvement for a few months. I would much rather see more people participating in clinical trials.
And research.
Yes, we need
Yeah.
that. We need representation from all different minorities. So far, our people that have been willing to participate in clinical trials are not very diverse. So we need to work on that. We need to work on that messaging. And I feel like we need to sort of, put our own arms out to, like I felt when I was taking that blood test, test me. I'll go first. I want to do that. And, until we're willing to do that, I don't know that I feel like I want to just go up there and shout on Capitol Hill, hey, pay for this for me. I think first I need to show that I'm willing to be tested, and I'm willing. I'm ready. I'm there.
That's honorable.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, are you still singing?
I am still singing at church. I wish I was still singing at the little restaurant, but
Yeah.
they almost had to close their doors because another big restaurant opened in front of them and took up a lot of their parking lot.
Oh,
So
no.
they couldn't afford live music for anymore. That was actually kind of sad.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I've connected with a few other local musicians. By the next time I talk to you, I have a feeling that I'm going to be able to tell you about a new gig.
Oh, I hope
Right now
so.
I'm just practicing. I'm just singing at church, but I
Okay.
want to get back in the saddle and do some more singing in other venues.
Music, the musician's daughter, that's who you are.
Absolutely, it's who I am.
So, what's on your horizon with the empty nest looming?
Well, I have a feeling I might become something of a snowbird because,
Oh,
yes, because, anybody who has real estate in Florida, I mean, it'd be crazy to give it up, right? I'm right here in Central Florida, so I'm not at risk on the coastline or anything. So, of course, I'm going to keep my property here. But with Christian being stationed in Connecticut, which is already my home state, part of my heart is there. So I would love to go and spend the summers there and then the winters here.
yeah.
And I'm so fortunate to work for an employer who allows me to work remotely. So that's actually a possibility.
Wow.
Mhm.
You have definitely thought of that.
I have absolutely thought of it. So much so, I actually have a small RV.
Okay.
It's a Class C, so it's the kind that has the little beds over the cab. So it's like the size of a U-Haul, kind of. So I love it. I can just put my two little dogs in there. I have two pugs, and I can bring them. Mm.
Yeah. Oh, Betsy, this is so much fun. Um, Thank you for being such an activist, and thank you for being the one to step up and say, I'll participate in the trials.
Absolutely. Count me in.
You're a leader.
Yep, I'm carrying the torch. And I'm carrying the torch so my sons don't have to.
Yeah.
I don't want them to have to do it. I want there, if not a cure, I want there to be a reliable test, and I want there not to be the fear. Like I said, we all have to die of something, but if you can live your best life, have comfort and dignity, I mean, to me that's good enough. I've already been so blessed. I just want to avoid the kind of suffering that my father went through.
Yeah.
If I can do that, that's huge.
I was really sad to hear that you said people shunned him. Like that was really very sad to hear because I didn't realize that. And I know he was part of the old coots at the fair or the market.
Yes, the old crews. I'm so happy to tell you that they are still going strong, and
Oh,
those men are heroes. You know what? I always knew, even though I only started it because I love my father,
yeah.
I only did it for him, but it ended up taking on a much greater life. The people that volunteered, they have loved it. They are still going strong, and they added a third member. And the three of them are this most amazing trio. They are just fascinating. They have the greatest conversations, and honestly, they are out there every month at the farmers market carrying on. Great.
All because of you and your dad.
Well, because of my dad and my love for him,
Yeah.
and I have a feeling it's just going to keep on going. People in the community love it.
That would
Hmm.
be cool to see it spread. Like that would be
Yes.
really cool. Like
Yes.
different states and then maybe into Canada, like the old coots. And what was the saying that you had? The advice? What was the
It may be bad advice, but it's free.
Yeah.
Yes, they proudly quote that slogan every time. It's printed on the banner on their tent.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, the advice you gave today is also free, but it's definitely not bad advice. So I just want to thank you, Betsy.
Thank you so much. This has been such a joy.
Following the passing of her father, Betsy has had time to reflect on his suffering, which has motivated her to become an activist. She is committed to improving the future for others who are living with Alzheimer's disease, whether through participating in Alzheimer's research and advancing scientific knowledge, or by connecting caregivers with essential resources. In her personal situation, she has made plans for her future care needs, designating her sons as administrators if necessary, and obtaining hybrid long-term care insurance to facilitate this arrangement. Betsy mentioned the helpful test model called GUIDE, which is Guiding an Improved Dementia Experience by CMS, designed to support people living with dementia and their unpaid caregivers. If you'd like more information on GUIDE, you can check it out on cms.gov or look for similar test models in your jurisdiction. If you're in the midst of your own caregiving journey and need some supports, I invite you to tap into AlongsideCaregiverConsulting.ca or Alongside Caregiver Consulting's Facebook page or Instagram account. Thank you for tuning in today, and to Betsy Haddad, thank you for sharing your updates and insightful reflections from your caregiving experience. If you enjoyed today's episode, tell your friends and other caregivers about it. And if you don't want to miss future episodes, be sure to subscribe to the Island Treasures podcasts. See you next episode.